The bell at St. Agnes. Every town has one rule nobody questions, the kind of local custom so old and so unremarkable on its surface that newcomers accept it without ever asking why it exists. The way you'd accept any small-town oddity is simple, regional color. In Millbrook Falls, the rule was this. The bell at St. Agnes, the old Catholic church at the edge of town, rings at exactly 9 o'clock every night without exception. Has for as long as anyone can remember. And when it rings, every single resident of that town, without needing to be told twice, makes absolutely certain they are inside a building with the doors locked before the final toll fades. I lived in Millbrook Falls for 6 years before I finally asked someone why, and the answer I got changed the way I understood that entire town and cost me something I am still, more than a year later, trying to find a way to live without. My name is Callum Reyes. I moved to Millbrook Falls for a teaching job at the regional high school, a small, quiet town of about 3,000 people, tucked into a valley that felt, when I first arrived, like exactly the kind of peaceful, unremarkable place I'd been looking for after several loud, exhausting years in the city. I noticed the 9 o'clock bell within my first week, the way you notice any local pattern, and I noticed, just as quickly, how completely the town organized itself around it. Restaurants closing by 8:30, the handful of bars in town enforcing a strict last call at 8:45. Parents visibly anxious if their kids were still outside as the hour approached. A kind of collective, unspoken discipline that felt, at first, almost quaint, the sort of small-town tradition you'd expect to find charming rather than concerning. I asked, casually, at various points over my first year there, why the bell mattered so much, and I want to describe the specific pattern of answers I got, because in hindsight, that pattern itself should have told me something. Older residents deflected with vague, half-joking references to old church tradition, or just the way things are done here. Younger residents, especially anyone under 30, generally admitted they didn't actually know the reason, only that their parents had drilled the habit into them so thoroughly that questioning it felt even now mildly transgressive, like asking why you shouldn't touch a hot stove. Nobody, in that entire first year, gave me anything close to a real answer, and I want to be honest that I stopped pushing for one, mostly because the custom itself cost me nothing. I was rarely out much past 9 anyway, and locking my doors at night seemed like ordinary, sensible behavior, regardless of whatever story justified it. It was in my 4th year in Millbrook Falls, once I'd built real friendships in the community and earned, I think, a level of trust that finally made people willing to talk more openly, that I got my first genuine answer from an elderly woman named Marguerite Voss, who'd taught at the same high school for nearly 40 years before retiring, and who I'd grown close to over several years of shared faculty lunches and, eventually, occasional dinners at her house. "You've been here long enough now," she told me one evening, in the careful, deliberate tone of someone finally deciding to share something she'd been weighing for a while. "I think you're owed the actual story, rather than the version we tell people who haven't earned it yet." The story she told me, over the course of that evening and several subsequent conversations, traced back to the early 1900s, when St. Agnes was first built, on land that, according to Marguerite, the original town founders had specifically chosen because of an older pre-settlement history the local indigenous community had warned them about. A history involving something they described, in terms Marguerite herself found difficult to translate precisely, as an old, hungry presence that occupied that particular stretch of valley long before any church or town existed there. Something that emerged, reliably, predictably, in the hours after full dark, and that the earlier inhabitants of that land had developed their own careful practices around avoiding. The church's founders, according to Marguerite's account, had built St. Agnes specifically to contain or manage whatever this presence actually was, incorporating the daily 9 o'clock bell as part of a broader, deliberate ritual practice meant to establish a clear, consistent boundary, a signal understood by the presence itself over decades of consistent repetition that after that bell rang, The town's residents would be inside, protected, and that the hours following it belonged, in some functional, if not entirely understood, sense, to whatever occupied that valley after dark. "Has anyone actually seen it?" I asked her. The same question I suspect anyone would ask, testing the story against some hope that it remained purely theoretical, an old superstition maintained out of caution, rather than genuine, ongoing necessity. Marguerite was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There have been incidents," she said carefully. "Not often, not in a way that gets discussed openly outside a small circle of people who need to know, for practical reasons, exactly what we're managing. But yes, there have been incidents, spaced out over the decades, always involving someone who was out past the bell for one reason or another, and always ending badly enough that the town has never once considered abandoning the tradition, no matter how strange it might look to an outsider. I want to tell you about the incident that finally, personally, made this story real for me, because up until that point, despite Marguerite's evident seriousness, I had still held some part of the story at arm's length. The way you hold any second-hand account of something you haven't experienced directly, however much you trust the person telling it to you. Marguerite eventually showed me something she said she'd never shown anyone outside her own family before. A small leather-bound ledger, kept privately by a succession of the town's oldest families since the church's founding, recording, in careful, spare handwriting, spanning more than a century, every documented incident connected to the valley's presence, dating back to the earliest recorded entry in 1911. I want to describe the shape of that ledger, rather than its specific contents, because Marguerite asked me, when she finally allowed me to look through it, not to record or repeat the individual names listed inside out of respect for families still living in the town who had never publicly connected their own history to entries in that book. What I can tell you is that the ledger recorded, by my own count, 23 incidents across those 100-plus years, averaging out to roughly one every 4 to 5 years, though the actual spacing was far less even than that average suggests. Long stretches of a decade or more with no entries at all, followed by clusters of 2 or 3 incidents within a single year. A pattern Marguerite herself couldn't fully explain, though she had her own theory, one she shared cautiously, aware of how speculative it necessarily was. I think it has something to do with how many people are paying proper attention," she said. "I think when a town gets complacent, when enough time passes that people start treating the bell as pure formality rather than genuine protection, that's when incidents seem to cluster. I think it's almost as if whatever's out there can sense when the town's collective vigilance has started to slip and takes advantage of exactly those windows. I don't have any way to prove that. It's simply the pattern I've noticed, looking at this ledger over many years now, and it's part of why I've always made sure to take the tradition as seriously in my 70s as I did as a young woman, regardless of how safe and settled everything might feel in any given year. It happened during my 5th year in Millbrook Falls on an ordinary Tuesday in October, when a colleague of mine, a science teacher named Diane Holt, who'd moved to town only about 8 months earlier, and hadn't yet, apparently, internalized the 9 o'clock rule with the same reflexive seriousness as longtime residents, got a flat tire on the outskirts of town around 8:30 in the evening, close enough to home that she decided, reasonably by any ordinary standard, to simply walk the remaining 1.5 miles, rather than wait for roadside assistance in the dark. She didn't make it home before the bell rang. I learned the details of what happened next only gradually, over the following weeks, pieced together from Diane's own halting, reluctant account, from what the town's small police department was willing to share, informally, and from Marguerite, who, once the incident became known within the town's informal network of people who took the bell seriously, filled in context that helped me understand exactly how serious this actually was. Diane described hearing the bell finish its 9 tolls while she was still roughly half a mile from her house, walking along a stretch of road with dense tree cover on both sides, no other buildings nearby where she could have quickly taken shelter. She described the temperature, dropping suddenly and significantly in the minutes immediately following the bell's final toll. A cold that had nothing to do with the mild October evening she'd stepped out into less than an hour before, and she described in a tone that Marguerite told me had remained shaken and halting even weeks later. An awareness of being watched from the tree line that built, steadily, into an unmistakable, physical certainty that something was moving parallel to her, matching her pace, close enough in the darkness that she occasionally caught what she described as a kind of displaced darkness, like a shape moving that was somehow darker than the actual dark around it. She ran the last quarter-mile to her house, she told us, faster than she'd run in years, and made it inside, doors locked, only moments, she believed, before whatever had been pacing her in the trees closed the remaining distance. And she described standing at her window afterward, unable to look away, watching a shape she still couldn't fully describe, stand motionless at the edge of her yard for nearly 20 minutes before it finally, slowly, withdrew back into the trees. Diane left Millbrook Falls entirely within 2 months of that incident, taking a teaching position in another state. And I don't blame her for that decision even slightly, having learned by that point enough about the town's actual history to understand exactly what she'd narrowly avoided. I want to describe my own close call before I tell you what happened to Aiden, because I think it matters that I nearly became one of the town's quiet, unspoken incidents myself in my second year there, well before I understood enough about the actual danger to be properly afraid of it. I'd stayed late grading papers at the high school one evening, distracted enough by the work that I lost track of time, in a way that was entirely out of character for me by then, having already internalized the 9 o'clock rule as thoroughly as any longtime resident. I left the building at 8:55, 5 minutes before the bell, with my car parked in the far lot, a walk of maybe 4 minutes under ordinary circumstances. I did not make it to my car before the bell began ringing. I want to describe exactly what I felt in those final tolls, walking briskly across an empty parking lot, with the sound rolling out across the whole valley behind me. A specific, mounting awareness, impossible to fully justify with anything I could actually see or hear, that the ordinary evening air around me had begun to change in some fundamental way, thickening, the way air thickens before a storm, except with no clouds, no wind, nothing meteorological to explain it. I made it to my car and locked the doors with the final toll still fading across the valley. And I sat there afterward, engine running, hands too unsteady to actually put the car in gear for almost a full minute, watching the tree line at the edge of the parking lot with a fixed animal attention I'd never needed to apply to anything in my life before that moment. Nothing happened. I want to be clear about that. No shape emerged from the trees, no sound beyond the ordinary settling of an empty parking lot at night. But I have never, in the years since, cut it that close again. And I understood, driving home that night far more carefully than usual, exactly why every single resident of that town treated a curfew the rest of the world would consider quaint with the deadly seriousness of an actual, immediate threat. I want to tell you about the piece of this story that affected me most directly, because it's the reason I can no longer talk about Millbrook Falls or that bell with anything close to the detached curiosity I once brought to asking Marguerite about local traditions. In my 6th year in town, my closest friend there, a fellow teacher named Aiden Marsh, who I'd known since my first year and who had, like everyone else, always taken the 9 o'clock rule completely seriously, went missing on a night that started, as far as anyone could reconstruct afterward, with nothing more unusual than a solo evening walk along the river trail that ran along the edge of town. A walk he'd taken dozens of times before, without incident. He did not come home. His car remained parked at the trailhead. His phone, when eventually found the following morning by a search party, was sitting on a rock near the river's edge, undamaged, fully charged, showing no signs of having been dropped or damaged in any struggle, simply left there deliberately, it seemed, at a spot along the trail that Marguerite told me, once she learned the details, was uncomfortably close to a specific, old boundary marker that the town's oldest families still maintained quietly, as the traditional edge of whatever territory the valley's original presence was understood to claim after dark. Aidan was never found. The search continued for nearly 3 weeks, extensive and thorough by any standard, involving state police resources beyond what the town's own small department could provide. And it concluded, eventually, the way these things apparently always concluded in Millbrook Falls' quiet, largely unspoken history of similar incidents, without a body, without any conclusive evidence of what had actually happened, and with an official finding of accidental drowning that satisfied the legal requirements of closing the case without actually explaining anything that had troubled those of us who knew him well enough to find that explanation impossible to fully accept. I left Millbrook Falls 4 months after Aidan's disappearance. I want to be honest that I didn't leave immediately, that I spent those 4 months trying in increasingly desperate and increasingly futile ways to find some answer that would make sense of what had happened to my friend. Some proof one way or another that would let me either accept the official explanation or understand fully what I actually believed had really happened to him instead. I never found that proof. What I found instead over those 4 months was Marguerite's own increasingly worn, weary willingness to keep talking to me about the town's actual history, filling in details she'd apparently held back even from me during our earlier conversations, either because she hadn't trusted me enough yet, or because she'd hoped, genuinely, that I would never need to know the fuller version. The bell doesn't just mark a boundary, she told me, near the end of my time there, in what turned out to be our final real conversation on the subject, before I finally packed up and left. I think over all these decades, it's also become something else. I think whatever's out there has learned, the same way anything learns given enough time, that the bell means something is finally about to be off limits for the night. And I think, more and more over the years, incidents seem to cluster in the final minutes, before it rings, rather than randomly throughout the evening the way you'd expect if this were simply about general nighttime danger. I think it's learned to make the most of the time it has left before that boundary closes, the same way anyone rushes to finish something important before a deadline they know is coming. I think about that observation, more than almost anything else, from my time in Millbrook Falls, because it reframes the entire tradition, in a way I find considerably more disturbing than the simpler story I'd originally been told. I no longer think of that bell as a peaceful, protective ritual maintained out of quaint, harmless local custom. I think of it as an old, uneasy truce between an entire town and something that has learned, patiently, over more than a century, exactly how much time it has each night before the town locks itself away, and exactly how to make the most efficient possible use of whatever window remains open before that happens. I don't live in Millbrook Falls anymore, and I don't intend to go back, though I still think about that town more often than I'd like to admit. And I still, even now more than a year and several hundred miles removed from that valley, find myself checking the time reflexively whenever evening starts to fall. Some deep, trained instinct, refusing to fully believe that the rule doesn't still apply wherever I happen to be standing. If you ever find yourself in a small town with a tradition that seems on its surface quaint or arbitrary or simply old, a bell that rings at a specific hour, a curfew nobody quite explains, a boundary everyone respects without being able to say exactly why, I would ask you to take it seriously anyway, even without knowing the full story behind it, because I have learned, at a cost I am still finding ways to live with, that some traditions survive for 100 years, not because people are foolishly superstitious, but because somewhere buried in the town's actual unspoken history is a reason serious enough that an entire community decided, generation after generation, that respecting it without question was simply safer than ever finding out exactly why.